All right, let's jump right in. Today we're diving into the world of Jeremiah. And let me tell you, this prophet didn't mess around.
No, he didn't. He had some pretty strong words for the people of Judah. Talk about tough love.
So who was this Jeremiah guy?
Well, he was a prophet in ancient Judah, called by God to deliver some, uh, let's just say, difficult messages.
Oh,
Mostly warnings,
yeah.
about the consequences of straying from their covenant with God.
Covenant, that sounds intense.
It was. Think of it as a sacred promise, a bond, like a marriage, between God and his people.
I see, like breaking a vow, a serious betrayal.
Exactly. And they'd been turning away from God, worshiping other gods. It was a big deal.
I can only imagine. So how does this all start?
Well, the book opens with Jeremiah receiving his mission from God. And it's not exactly a walk in the park. God lays out his judgment, no holds barred against the people of Jerusalem and Judah. Their wickedness, their idolatry, it's all there.
Straight to the point, huh?
No sugarcoating. But what really struck me was the opposition Jeremiah was going to face. I mean, imagine telling people what they didn't want to hear day in and day out.
Yeah, not exactly going to win you any popularity contests.
But God prepares him, tells him, they'll fight against you but won't overcome you, for I am with you. He makes him like a fortified city, an iron pillar, a bronze wall.
Sounds like he was going to need it.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so they weren't following the rules, but come on, was it really that bad? What had they done that was so awful?
Well, remember that covenant. It was a big deal, a sacred bond. They were straying from that big time.
Right, the sacred promise. So turning away from God was
Like spiritual adultery. Imagine the hurt, the anger, the betrayal in any close relationship. That's the kind of intensity we're talking about.
wow, that puts it into perspective. And you mentioned that image of Israel as an unfaithful bride earlier.
Yeah, it's a powerful metaphor that pops up throughout the book.
It really drives home the emotional impact of what they were doing.
But here's the thing. Even with those strong warnings, there's this recurring call to repentance. It's not just about punishment.
So God was still open to reconciliation.
Absolutely. He wanted his people to turn back to him. There's even that line, return faithless people. He promises to heal your apostasies.
Okay, hold on. Apostasy, that's a new one.
Basically, it means turning away from God, abandoning their faith, breaking that covenant relationship. But the point is, God's willing to heal that brokenness.
So even amidst judgment, there's still this chance for forgiveness.
Always. That's the heart of it. But let's be real, it doesn't sound like they were exactly rushing back to God.
And that's where things get a bit more dramatic, right? Jeremiah doesn't just say, hey, you guys messed up. He goes all out with the imagery.
Oh yeah, he paints a vivid picture, doesn't he? You've got scorching winds, mountains quaking, hills swaying. Apocalyptic.
It sounds intense.
Like a disaster movie. He even says in chapter 4, I looked at the land, it was an empty wasteland. Talk about bleak.
Wow. So he's not holding back on the consequences.
Not at all. The devastation, the emptiness, it's all there, front and center. A wake-up call, you could say.
Definitely a wake-up call. And he even gets specific about what's going to happen to Jerusalem, describing its destruction in detail.
Yeah, the city in ruins, people scattered, the temple destroyed. It's heartbreaking stuff. This is where that nickname, the Weeping Prophet, really fits.
You can feel his anguish. He wasn't just delivering a message, he was genuinely heartbroken.
It's palpable, isn't it? But it's like they weren't listening, like they had earplugs in.
And to make matters worse, you've got this conflict with the false prophets. Talk about mixed messages.
Oh yeah, these guys were telling the people everything was fine, promising peace and security. Can you imagine trying to sort through all that?
It's a dilemma we still face today, right? Trying to figure out who to trust, what's true, amidst all the noise.
You said it. But Jeremiah was adamant. Genuine repentance, he insisted, went beyond just going through the motions of religious rituals.
It had to be more than just outward actions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It had to come from a real change of heart, a transformation from within.
And he really hammered that home in his temple sermon. Talk about a bold move, standing right there in their holy place and saying, you're all talk and no action.
You know, that message still resonates today. It makes you think about our own faith, doesn't it? Is it just for show, or does it truly shape the way we live?
It's a question worth asking ourselves.
Absolutely. And then there's that powerful metaphor in chapter 18. God is the potter, Israel is the clay.
I love that one. It's such a powerful image of God's control, but also their potential.
Right. The clay can either harden and become unusable,
Yeah.
or it can be molded into something beautiful, something purposeful.
Their choices mattered, even within God's plan.
Exactly. It's this beautiful interplay of divine sovereignty and human responsibility.
And speaking of choices, there's that one part that really surprised me in chapter 17 where he talks about the Sabbath.
The Sabbath, what about it?
Well, he actually says that observing the Sabbath is key to future blessing. I mean, with all the doom and gloom, that seems unexpected.
I know, right? It's like a glimmer of light amidst all the darkness. But remember, Sabbath observance was a sign of their covenant with God.
A reminder of their unique relationship.
Exactly. It's like he's saying, look, even now, there's a path back to restoration, a way to experience God's favor. But it requires commitment.
It's not just about following rules blindly.
No, it's about that inner transformation, that alignment with God's will.
So outward actions matter, but only if they reflect what's going on inside.
You got it. But reading through Jeremiah, you can't help but feel the weight of his message. Delivering those pronouncements, it couldn't have been easy.
He must have felt so much pressure. And in chapters 15 and 20, we see that inner turmoil, that anguish he was going through.
It's raw and honest, isn't it? He pours out his heart to God, expressing his anger, his frustration, even his doubts.
He even curses the day he was born. That's heavy stuff.
It is, but it makes you realize that prophets were human too. They struggled, they doubted, they felt pain, just like us.
But they kept going.
And that's the key, isn't it? Even when it's hard, even when it hurts.
Yeah. So even amidst all that hardship and despair, there are these glimpses of hope sprinkled throughout the book.
Like little beacons, reminding us that even in the darkest night, there's a flicker of light.
And that's something we all need to remember. There's always hope.
So we were talking about that glimmer of hope amidst all the intensity. It's like Jeremiah is constantly reminding us that even when things look bleak, God is still there.
Right. And it wasn't just about personal failings, right? There was a whole lot of political drama going on, too. Like Jeremiah lived during some serious upheaval.
Oh, yeah, major power shifts happening all around. Think of it like this. The old superpower, the Assyrian Empire, he was falling apart, and a new empire, Babylon, was rising to take its place.
Ah, so it was like a changing of the guard, a whole new world order emerging, and Judah was caught in the middle of all this.
Smack dab in the crosshairs. The kings of Judah, they were trying to play both sides, sometimes aligning with Egypt to resist Babylon.
Talk about a high-stakes game, so they were caught between a rock and a hard place.
Exactly. It was a dangerous game, and some of Jeremiah's prophecies actually reflect this whole political struggle. Like in chapter 21, he warns King Zedekiah not to rely on Egypt for help.
Oh, so he was basically saying, don't put all your eggs in that basket.
Exactly. The Babylonians are going to win, he told him. Resisting them will only make things worse. Can you imagine having to deliver that message to a king?
Yikes. I bet that didn't make him very popular with the political elite.
No kidding. They probably saw him as a traitor, a defeatist.
But it wasn't just external pressure, right? He talks about his own inner struggles, too.
Oh, yeah. In chapter 15, he really pours out his heart, talks about feeling like a man of strife and conflict.
Like he's bearing the weight of the world on his shoulders.
It's so relatable, you know? He's not just this perfect, untouchable prophet. He's real, he's raw, he's honest about his doubts, his anger. There's even that part where he curses the day he was born.
Wow, that's heavy. It really shows how human he was, struggling with this immense responsibility.
But he kept going, kept speaking truth, even when it was hard. And that's what makes his message so compelling, I think.
It's the authenticity that draws you in. But did anyone actually listen to him? Was there ever a moment where it seems like they might turn things around?
Well, there were glimmers of hope, moments where it seemed like they might be turning back to God. Like in chapter 34, when King Zedekiah releases the Hebrew slaves. Remember?
Oh, yeah. Finally fulfilling that covenant obligation. It felt like a huge step.
Like a turning point. But sadly, it didn't last.
Oh, no. What happened?
They went back on their word, forced the slaves back into servitude. It's heartbreaking, really.
One step forward, two steps back. It's like they had a chance and they blew it.
And that's where that powerful image of the potter's jar comes in, that smashing of the clay jar in chapter 19.
Oh, yeah, that's a vivid one.
Right in front of the elders and priests, Jeremiah smashes it, symbolizing the destruction coming upon Jerusalem.
It's like the point of no return, that moment when everything changes.
Exactly. And from there, we see these really grim predictions about the fate of Jerusalem, the capture of the city, the temple destroyed, the people exiled.
It's heavy stuff. But even amidst all that, there's still that glimmer of hope, that promise of a future restoration.
And those promises, they become even more powerful when you think about what they were about to lose, their homes, their city, their identity. everything.
So what kind of hope could he offer them? What could he possibly say in the face of such overwhelming loss?
Well, in chapter 29, there's this incredible message of hope for the exiles in Babylon. You know the one. For I know the plans I have for you. God's talking about plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future.
That's such a powerful verse, and it's amazing how relevant it still is today, even when we're facing our own struggles.
But imagine hearing that when you've been uprooted from everything you know, forced to live in a foreign land.
It must have been like a lifeline, a reason to keep going.
Absolutely. But it's not just about physical restoration. He talks about spiritual renewal, too. A new covenant where God's law is written on their hearts, not just on tablets of stone.
So it's not just about going back, but about becoming new.
Yeah, like a fresh start. And that idea of a new covenant is so central to Jeremiah's message.
It's like saying, even though things have fallen apart, God's not giving up.
You got it.
Hmm.
God's making a new promise, one based on an inner transformation, not just external rituals.
Okay, we've talked a lot about God's covenant with Israel, but what about everyone else? Did Jeremiah have anything to say about other nations?
He did. Jeremiah was a prophet to the nations. In chapters 46 through 51, you'll find pronouncements against foreign nations, like Egypt, Babylon, Moab, Edom, you name it.
Wow, I had no idea. And were they all about judgment and destruction?
Well, many of them did involve warnings, often related to their treatment of Israel or their own, straying from what was right.
Mm.
But even in those pronouncements, there's a sense of God's concern for all people.
So it's like God is holding everyone accountable, regardless of who they are or where they're from.
Exactly. It's a universal message. And there are even glows of hope for those other nations, too. For example, in his oracle against Elam, there's this prediction that after judgment, God will restore them, bring them back to their land.
So even for those who've opposed God, there's still a chance for reconciliation.
Always. God's mercy is far-reaching. And it really highlights how complex Jeremiah's message is. He's not just doom and gloom. There's always this thread of hope woven through it.
I'm really curious about that story in chapter 35 about the Rechabites. They were a nomadic clan, right? And they lived a very strict, simple life.
You got it. They followed all these rules passed down from their ancestor Jonadab, no wine, no settling down.
Like a super traditionalist group.
Right. And Jeremiah uses them as an example. It's like he's saying, look, even these nomads are more committed to their ancestors than you are to God.
Ouch. That's got to sting. So he's basically calling out their hypocrisy.
Yeah, and he really drives it home. He even invites them to the temple and offers them wine, which they refuse. They're like, nope, we're sticking to our ancestors' commands.
So it's a test. He's showing the people of Judah how they should be acting.
It's a brilliant move. And you know what? God actually commends the Rechabites for their obedience, promises them that they'll never lack descendants.
Wow, so they passed the test. But is the message here just about blind obedience to rules? Or is there something deeper going on?
I think it's more about the heart, The Rechabites were completely dedicated to honoring their ancestors' will. They were all in. And that's the kind of commitment God wants from his people.
It's about loyalty that goes beyond just ticking boxes.
You said it.
Yeah.
But then there's another layer to it, isn't there? I mean, the Rechabites were loyal to their human ancestor. But Jeremiah is pointing to something even bigger, a loyalty to God, the ultimate authority.
Right. It's about where our ultimate loyalties lie. It makes you think. So we were talking about the Rechabites and their unwavering commitment to their ancestors' will. It really highlights the contrast with the people of Judah, doesn't it?
It does. It makes you wonder about their priorities. And this whole idea of holding leadership accountable, it pops up again and again in Jeremiah.
Yeah, he definitely didn't shy away from calling out those in power. Kings, priests, false prophets. No one was exempt.
Remember that temple sermon? He risked everything to confront those leaders.
Talk about courage. And it wasn't just words either, right? He faced some pretty serious consequences for speaking out.
Oh yeah, imprisonment, threats, even physical abuse. It's hard to imagine going through all that.
It makes you wonder how he kept going. What kept him from just giving up?
Well, in those moments of despair, you see him turning back to God, pouring out his heart in those raw, honest laments. But even in the darkest moments, there's this glimmer of hope, a recognition of God's faithfulness, even when his own faith is shaky.
It's that human element, isn't it?
Right.
The struggle, the doubt. It makes him so much more relatable.
Totally. He's not this perfect, untouchable prophet. He's real. He wrestles with his doubts, his fears, but ultimately chooses to trust in God.
It's a good reminder that faith isn't about perfection, it's about perseverance. You don't have to have it all figured out, you just have to keep going.
Exactly. And ultimately, that's what makes Jeremiah's story so hopeful. Despite all the pronouncements of judgment, despite his own personal struggles, he never loses sight of God's plan for restoration.
And that plan wasn't just for the people of Judah back then, right? It's for all of us, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It extends to everyone who chooses to follow God, who chooses to turn away from selfish desires and embrace a life of faithfulness.
It's about aligning ourselves with something bigger than ourselves. So what can we take away from all of this? What does Jeremiah have to say to us today?
Well, I think he challenges us to look inward, to ask ourselves some tough questions. Where are we placing our trust? What idols are we clinging to? Are we willing to let go of our comfort, our security, to follow what we believe is right?
It's a call to examine our hearts, to admit where we've messed up, and to be open to a new beginning.
It's about that new covenant written on our hearts, a transformation that goes deeper than just outward actions.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm struck by how powerful his words still are. Thousands of years later, they still speak to us, challenge us, comfort us.
It's a reminder that even when things feel chaotic and uncertain, there's a bigger story unfolding, and we have a choice in how we respond.
So if you're looking for inspiration, a challenge, or just a glimmer of hope in the midst of all the craziness, I encourage you to check out the book of Jeremiah for yourself.
It might just surprise you.
Until next time, keep diving deep.